All right, I think that is just about everybody. So hello and welcome to another curatorial conversation. I'm Bill Sherman. I'm director of the Warburg Institute. And as many of you will know, we started this series at the Warburg about 5 years ago in order to take a behind the scenes look at some of the most interesting work being done in museums today. In London sometimes, across the UK sometimes, and even around the world. We've featured temporary exhibitions, permanent collections, and entire museums. And the series is designed to draw out discoveries made, challenges tackled, and lessons learned. Now, for today's conversation, we have joined forces with our colleagues at the Association for Art History, better known as the AAH, and I'm really delighted to share my hosting duties with the association's CEO, Greg Perry. Greg's own work in museums, as well as his innovative role in supporting the field of art history, would probably be worth a curatorial conversation of its own. And maybe we'll plan that later, Greg. But when he and I decided to think about joining forces and bringing our different audiences together and kind of cast our eyes over the current exhibition projects that seem to be worth a conversation, we quickly agreed to converge on the Queen's House in Greenwich for a closer look at Allison and Imogen's wonderful show on the Veldes, not just for its exceptional content, but also, as you'll see, for its unusually resourceful curation. So here I will hand over to Greg to just say a few words of welcome on behalf of the AAH, and then to introduce our two curators for tonight. Greg.
Great. Thanks a lot, Bill. Yes, we're so pleased to be working with the Warburg on this curatorial conversation event because it comports so well with our curatorial initiative, and that's what sort of brought Bill and I together to talk about these things. We began our initiative in 2019, so we felt like there was a bit of a lacuna in the UK as far as an offer for curators more generally beyond the subject specialist networks for curators to come together to discuss topics of current relevance, to create, we wanted to create opportunities for professional development, for them to share expertise. And we also wanted to promote and advocate for the work, for curatorial work in the UK. So what we've done with this initiative is we've had online and in-person events around topics of interest. We've got a mentoring and a peer support program, and we established a curatorial prize for exhibitions 2 years ago, and now which we're going to expand to installations and publications. New initiatives that we're working on are something around well-being for curators. We're working with the Museums Association, who did this more generally for those in the museum field. This will be for art museum curators. That is just going on. That we just put a well-being survey online for curators to fill out. We're doing a skills development work stream for curators, and also we're going to be looking at climate change issues and challenges that it means for the challenges that it presents for those in the curatorial sector, and how we can best prepare curators for to meet those challenges. So if you can go to our website, it's forarthistory.org.uk, and you can learn about this curatorial initiative. And we do welcome people to join us and have a look at what we're doing. And we're very much looking forward to our discussion today. So back to you, Bill. Thanks.
That's great. So everybody probably knows our format by now. We tend to start with some kind of glimpse for those particularly who haven't been to see an exhibition, giving us a sense, in this case, of really the unusual setting and setup, as well as a little bit about what led our curatorial colleagues to do the ambitious and crazy project that they took on. And then we will ask them a few questions, Greg and I, back and forth. And then by then you will have stored up some questions of your own in the audience, and we will have some time at the end for a bit of general Q&A. So without further ado, I think we should hand over to Allison and Imogen, and they will take us into the Queen's House.
Hey. Well, thank you so much, Bill and Greg. It's a real pleasure for both of us to be here. Can everyone see my screen before?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
it looks
working.
good.
Okay, excellent. So you'll have to forgive us if so Imogen and I are obviously in two different places right now. I'm not actually in 17th century Greenwich, which is what you're seeing behind me. But we are doing a bit of a double act this evening, but the technology might be slightly complicated with two people trying to control one set of slides. So do bear with us. Also, I must apologize in advance if I involuntarily cough. I have one of these sort of post-viral annoying cough things that's going around, so apologies in advance. So the Van der Veldes at the Queen's House in Greenwich, perhaps not so well known actually, that the Van der Veldes, the leading marine painters of the 17th century, actually had their studio in Greenwich in the Queen's House. They were of course, the leading marine painters of the 17th century. Here we have on the left the Elder sketching firsthand the Battle of Scheveningen, which you can see here in this magnificent pen painting. He's the gentleman in the wide-brimmed hat with, you can see his well, not pen, in fact, a stick of graphite and a porte-crayon, which we might get onto later. That's important because graphite is waterproof, of course. This is not a pen, but there he is sketching the Battle of Scheveningen, front row seats there. And then the Younger on the right in this magnificent portrait from the Rijksmuseum, paying homage, if you like, to his father as the draftsman. And together they formed this highly successful family business, this studio business that really exploited, if you like, the complementary talents of the Elder, who throughout his life really refers to himself as a draftsman. In fact, he was not trained in oil painting, and he made a point of sending his son, the Younger, to train as an oil painter with Simon de Vlieger, in fact. But the two of them together with these complementary talents, on the one hand, the Elder, a specialist in line, if you like, and the Younger, a specialist in light, together formed this highly successful studio business, which in the winter of 1672-73, they decide to uproot and move from Amsterdam to England. It's not known exactly why they chose to make this move, but it's one that actually quite a number of Dutch artists made at the time. Charles II, bearing in mind this was a moment that England was at war with the Dutch Republic, Charles II actually issues a general invitation to all Dutch citizens to relocate to England, to bring with them their skills, and in exchange for this, he would offer them favorable tax conditions, freedom of religion, freedom from press, which meant freedom from conscription, effectively. And so there was a real incentive. This was also the so-called disaster year in Dutch history, as a result of this war between the Dutch Republic and England, a coalition between England and France. Amsterdam was effectively under siege, and hence the economy collapsed, and with it, of course, the art market. So there were certain push and pull factors, if you like. It's possible also that the Van der Veldes received a personal invitation from the king, because they were already at that time the leading marine painters of the day, and enjoyed a clientele right across Europe. Regardless of the reason for why they decided to move, Charles II made sure that they stayed, and he paid them each a salary of £100, and in fact James, Duke of York, actually paid the Elder an extra £50 a year, and that was just a retainer, so that didn't include the prices for any actual commissions on top of that. And in addition to that, they were given a rather privileged studio space in the Queen's House, which you can see here in a picture, a rather charming picture of Greenwich seen from the Royal Park, looking down to the Queen's House, painted by another of these Dutch painters who moved to England during this period, Hendrik Dankerts. And you'll make out in the foreground there's even a lovely little image of an artist sketching, probably Dankerts himself, not the Van der Veldes. But if you look at the Queen's House, which, if I use my pointer, is this one here, the Van der Veldes studio was this, or at least we understand it to be, certainly on the south side, looking across to the park, and probably this southwest corner here, these two windows here. So I'll hand over to Imogen. We're going to do a slightly informal to and fro, so we'll be bouncing off each other. But Imogen, I think
I will
a little bit about the Queen's House here. Yeah.
This point. It's worth saying that when the Van der Veldes came to the Queen's House and set up their studio there, the Queen's House at that point was a grace and favour residence, no longer a royal residence, but really somewhere where artists, the Astronomer Royal, a jeweller, there are various people recorded working there in the 1670s and 1680s when the Van der Veldes were present there. So they would have been among a group of other sort of cultured specialists using this space at the Queen's House. It was, of course, particularly fitting for the Van der Veldes because of Greenwich's setting on the Royal River Thames, between the Royal Dockyards at Deptford and Woolwich. This building was a really practical place for them to sketch on the Thames, to visit the Royal Dockyards, and to study the crafts that were their bread and butter. The Queen's House subsequently has had many different functions since the Van der Veldes were there. It's been the residence of a Prime Minister's wife, it's been an orphanage, it's been a school, and today the building is now the home of Royal Museums Greenwich, that is the National Maritime Museum's art collection. So the building once again is home to a number of Van der Veldes which hang on the walls there. So by this sort of twist of fate, the museum is the custodian of both the building where the Van der Veldes had their studio, and also, thanks to the National Maritime Museum's collection, the world's largest collection of Van der Veldes. So this encompasses many oil and pen paintings, some 1,400 drawings, and the very fine Solvay tapestry that we'll talk about in a minute. But we, working on this project, we quickly came to the realization that this collection is really unique in what it can tell us about how marine artist studio worked, but really about how any big artist studio worked, particularly the drawings collection. So many drawings surviving from the studio of so many different kinds that give us a real insight into the role that drawing played in their broader practice. The Van der Veldes have had time in Greenwich before as an exhibition, but not since the early 1980s. But our exhibition, conceived in lockdown, as perhaps Allison will say a little bit more about in a second, this project was never conceived as a monographic show, which the Dutch Maritime Museum in Amsterdam did so brilliantly a couple of years ago, 2021, 2022. This exhibition project, which is on until January, you can still go, this really focuses on the Van der Veldes' time in the Queen's House and their role as court artists, with a real focused look at their studio process and what that looked like in the house itself. The Queen's House is not a white cube, and we'll show you some images that demonstrate that, but this in a way is key to the narrative, this idea of bringing the Van der Veldes' work back into the places where these works were conceived. I mean, Allison now is showing us, this is Greenwich's Solvay tapestry, one of a series of 5 panels commissioned to commemorate the Battle of Solvay, one of the most important battles that James, Duke of York, future James II, was in command of as Lord High Admiral. So a kind of, if you like, a kind of Stuart response to the Armada, these sort of celebrations of Stuart sea power. These cartoons, the cartoons for these tapestries are really the first evidence that we have of the Van der Veldes working in the Queen's house. The cartoons do not survive, but the first mention we have of them in the building is of permission being given for them to lay out the cartoons above stairs in the house, and to bring the Solvay tapestry back into one of the rooms where it was possibly conceived. Probably these cartoons were laid out on the first floor, and the Solvay tapestry in our exhibition is the beginning. It's the kind of opening with a bang, if you like, of the show. It really gives you some sense of the scale of the project of the Van der Veldes producing these cartoons, and the amount of floor space that would be required. To see the tapestry in situ gives you a real sense of the kind of ambition of that project, if you like.
And the tapestry was one of two major conservation projects that fed into this exhibition. The sort of, I suppose, the primary impetus for the project was the conservation of this picture on the right, a royal visit to the fleet, which is about 4 meters across. That photo doesn't really do it justice, but it does give you some sense of the sort of difficulties of working within a space that isn't a white cube, because it's not ideal viewing conditions, but it was the only spot literally that was possible to hang it in the house. But this and the tapestry together were two major conservation projects which were ongoing as we were sort of bringing this exhibition together, and we'd always had in mind the first project that we started with was the work on the painting, and we'd always had in mind that this would be displayed for the 350th anniversary of the Van der Veldes moving to England this year. COVID sort of got in the way somewhat, but we thankfully built in a bit of a buffer so that it didn't matter so far as the exhibition or the display of the picture was concerned. But certainly it's worth saying that the entire project was, if you like, a COVID project insofar as it was an opportunity really to showcase the permanent collection of the museum, and to showcase these two major conservation projects that were ongoing. In both cases, both the tapestry and the painting, neither work was actually in a condition that was fit for display. So this is the first time that both of these objects have been on display in over 20 years, and they provide, if you like, a kind of bookend to the first floor of the exhibition. The exhibition unfolds over a series of rooms throughout the Queen's house, which are, like we say, not white cube purpose-built exhibition spaces, rather important former royal domestic interiors. Although you then have to add to that the fact that the Queen's house itself, as you can see in Dankertz's painting, actually straddled a road originally. So not only are we dealing with a very important historic space that is not purpose-built for modern day exhibitions, but we're dealing with a building that is by any measure highly eccentric in its layout. So the tapestry and the royal visit to the fleet, which is the painting on the right, form, if you like, the bookends of the top floor of the exhibition, which really looks at the Van der Veldes as court artists to the later Stuart kings, and then it makes its way downstairs to the actual studio space of the Van der Veldes, which you can see here, which we've dressed specially for the occasion. So normally this is used essentially as an event space. I mean, it is a public gallery, but it's a room that is let out for events, and it's not normally a space where you really get a very tangible sense of the Van der Veldes at work. So we thought that, this was the occasion to really take the plunge with that. And in this downstairs space, we also look at the drawings, which, although not a conservation project per se, are, if you like, the third element of this sort of triumvirate of really object-led elements to the exhibition. We were very lucky to receive a very generous grant from the Getty Foundation paper project to digitize the entire collection of 1,500 Van der Velde drawings in the collection. And the sort of premise of that project was really to make a connection between that collection of drawings and the physical space of the studio. So this slide just gives you a taster of the sheer variety of the kinds of drawings in the collection. But we were particularly interested in this idea of drawings as relics of studio practice. We wanted to give this sense of a studio space that would have been overflowing with paper. And here two examples which give you a sense of this kind of approach that we were taking. On the left, you see a drawing that's been splashed rather beautifully with oil. We presume linseed or walnut oil that the Van der Veldes used as their binding medium. And on the right, this is well, it's interesting for various reasons, including the fact that it's an offset, i.e. a sort of counterproof. So there's a fold actually in this drawing across the middle there, and you can see that the bottom motif is a direct mirror image of the top, because this sheet has been folded and the top side rubbed to make an impression, to create this bottom image, to create a mirror image of that motif. But it's also, as you'll see, it has these rather wonderful oily fingerprints. Now, of course, we don't know if these are Van der Velde fingerprints, and we don't know if that oil splash happened in the Van der Velde studio, but in a way that was kind of beside the point, because we were interested in really looking at these drawings as three-dimensional objects that were relics of this creative process. And as part of the Getty grant, like I say, we digitized the full collection of drawings, and there's an online feature, a sort of resource with videos and interactive elements that will outlive the exhibition. In addition to that, we also had a couple of digital interventions within the exhibition space, and you can see one of those here on this easel. The idea being that it sort of brought to life how drawings were used in different ways to create a painting. And then to round it off, Imogen, I don't know if you want to say a little bit about just how much this whole process actually became a research exercise in and of itself.
Yes, so, let's rewind back sort of, oh gosh, I can't even imagine, 9 months ago or something, and Allison wearing gloves and sort of aging paper and covering things in dusty fingerprints. This whole process of putting together the studio has been a real exercise in practice-based research. Yet there we are with our wonderful colleague.
The rather therapeutic afternoon in the boardroom, where we with thanks to our colleagues in the art team and conservation teams at Greenwich, we recreated 17th century paper.
Even, I mean, I'm looking at this now, and I'll say a bit more about the studio, but even this process of creating the paper. So we sourced our paper and we wanted to deliberately age it, but you can see Emmanuelle on the left here. She's making rolls of paper. So one of the very special things about how Velde the Elder worked is that he's drawing at sea on these very long rolls of paper. Practical, you can roll them up, you can have a long horizon line drawn on these long sheets in advance, so you can then place the ships at speed on the horizon. But as Emmanuelle was trying to rapidly make these rolls of paper, she was saying, they must have done it like this. It'd be much faster to make one very long roll, and then you could cut it into pieces according to how much you wanted. And we thought, well, never thought of that. We're not going to be able to prove it, but thinking through very practically how these things would have worked. And another example like that, Allison, if you want to go go back to the shot of the studio, is thinking about how the offset process worked. Part of the offset process, you're transferring graphite from one sheet to another through making the sheets damp and then rubbing very hard. But how did they make that sheet damp? Well, again, Emmanuel, trying things out, was saying a sponge would be the most practical way of doing this. We've been thinking about brushes or cloths, and she said no, actually a damp sponge would really be the thing. So you can see we've included a sponge here among the many instruments we've included here. Our sources for the studio were as varied as we could make them. There are lots of visual sources, of course. The whole genre of artist studio scenes from exactly this period, including this portrait of an artist in his studio, once thought to be Willem van der Velde the Younger. Now this is disputed. It's been suggested it might be Adrian van der Velde, the brother, but again, we do not know this artist's identity. But you can see that this artist is working with a selection of drawings of ships and marine scenes in the composition of the painting on his easel, which actually seems to be a port scene rather than a marine scene as such. But as Allison is showing you here, we've got a little nod to this painting here with our selection of drawings sort of selected from our portfolio. Allison mentioned before this idea of the studio overflowing with paper, and we'll talk a bit later on about the process of reconstructing this studio and what that has prompted in our minds and in our research about how the Van der Veldes probably stored their drawings, which is hopefully an important point that we'll hopefully come on to later. But the most obvious thing to note here, as well as these sort of vessels for holding ink, for holding washes, which you can see the obvious source here from Jan Steen's drawing lesson. Also the ship model. One of the only written sources there is related to the Van der Velde studio is an art historian from the time remarking on how Velde the Elder had a ship model which he used often in his work, and we worked very closely with the curator of ship models at Greenwich and a model maker to produce this very beautiful simplified model to show the kind of thing we think the Van der Veldes would have had in their studio. I can see Bill and Greg appearing, so we've probably gone on for long enough, and we'll be able to pick up on all these other points later.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic, Imogen, and thank you, Allison, as well. Let's just leave you could leave the slides up, I think, if you want, because you may want to be able to refer to them as we go through some questions. But we'll just jump in, I think, quickly and follow up on maybe the most obvious high-level questions that you've already led us to. And I suppose those are the links between this project and the building that it's in, and the links between the exhibition and the permanent collection at the Queen's House. So just to quickly come back to the building, as you said many times, it is not a white cube, although it sort of is from the outside, but it definitely is not on the inside in terms of its display limitations as a grade 1 listed structure, complicated house, very many opportunities, I think, and many challenges. And I wonder if you want to just say a little bit more about some of what you were able to do and some of what you were able to not do because of the conditions of the house.
Sure. I mean, I suppose that, most fundamentally, the great thing about this project was, being able to bring together the actual objects of the studio with the space of the studio. I mean, at the most fundamental level, of course. So that in a way was the sort of greatest opportunity. But then, I mean, I think as we've suggested, there are all sorts of challenges as to when you're dealing with a building as important as the Queen's House, a scheduled ancient monument, grade 1 listed. It is, it's no exaggeration to say that this is, one of the most important buildings in the country, and when you're dealing with building fabric that is this important, you need to think very, very carefully as to where you can hang things and in what way. So suffice to say, the physical constraints of the building certainly played a role in the narrative that we were able to tell, and how we were able to tell that. Certainly, had this been an exhibition in a purpose-built white cube space, and you're absolutely right to say the Queen's House is in many ways literally a white cube, but had this been in, for example, our special exhibition space in the basement of the Maritime Museum, it would have been a very different exhibition, but it also wouldn't have been, wouldn't have had that sort of USP of actually presenting this collection in the studio and in the building in which many of these objects had spent time. I think the particular sort of circumstances or the history of the National Maritime Museum collection is that it came together in the 20th century. There's not actually a sort of unbroken provenance between the Van der Velde studio and the Van der Velde collection that now happens to be at Greenwich, but it's a sort of happy reunion, if you like. Ordinarily, it's quite a tricky circle to square in the Queen's House, where you have this building that is incredibly important architecturally, historically, and I think often people come to it and assume that they're going to enter a sort of historic house environment, and there are certainly elements of that. You can see that in this beautiful frieze, for example, in the first room of the exhibition, which we now refer to as the King's Presence Chamber. There are sort of hints of that original scheme, but no movable objects, if you like, original to the house. So it's ordinarily quite a tricky one to reconcile in our interpretation of the house, how we present it to visitors, having on the one hand the building, and then on the other hand this collection of largely maritime themed art within it. But in this case, actually, the two dovetail really nicely together.
Although I think following on
go ahead, Imogen.
Oh, thank you. Following off that, I think it's worth saying, this frieze in the King's Presence Chamber is one very fine example of something from the 17th century, but a lot of there are sort of details in the fabric of what visitors experience that is more recent interventions in the fabric of the house. And this was, I think, a particular challenge in the studio was to present the studio as a 17th century studio in a space that to many eyes might look old enough to be a 17th century studio, and yet the existing shutters aren't the original shutters. And yet, one of the most interesting documents we have about the Van der Velde's time in the studio is that they had shutters installed. So there are these kinds of our interpretation, I think, had to work quite hard in order to convey some of these complications about the building, as well as Allison has mentioned, some of the more kind of practical constraints we had in terms of wall space, varying sizes in rooms. Allison also she spoke earlier about the way we have two massive masterpieces bookending this sort of suite of rooms, but that suite of rooms is very long. I think our exhibition is quite a long exhibition, and that in itself is something that we might have a white cube, it might not have been so long, but yeah, we had the opportunity of these spaces in the house, and we wanted to make the most of what we could do with them.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when we were in that room together, and I have to confess that Greg and I had the best private tour ever, we were, I think, very struck by two things. One is the obvious echo between the border of the tapestry and the frieze above by the ceiling. And that really felt resonant in this context and really kind of plugged you right in. At the same time, we were able to kind of take a look behind it, and you've had to do the most extraordinary kind of scaffolding to prevent anything from marring the wall or woodwork in any way, because of course it's entirely forbidden now to poke any holes in anything. So yeah, again, here you get both the resonance and I think the logistical challenge. Greg, do you want to just pick up on the other question about the connection with the permanent collection?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And I think it follows on well from the conversation you're having. Yeah, I mean, I recall back in the economic downturn of 2008, 2009, how we in the museum sector were encouraged to do more with our permanent collections. And this came out again during austerity here. And now there are certainly environmental concerns which are maybe encouraging that approach as well. So, and I think the really unusual, possibly unique, but the originally really unusual thing about this exhibition is it takes place wholly within the permanent collection, of the gallery. And I wonder if you can just talk about that and some of the delicate approach you had to take to keeping the integrity of an exhibition intact, as well as the integrity of a permanent collection intact in the same galleries.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, perhaps one thing to one of the sort of not secrets, but or I don't know, not cheating, but there are certainly aspects of the exhibition which were relatively, it was sort of repurposing permanent hangs. So it was kind of, judicious, slight rehang of certain aspects in certain rooms. And then really, like Imogen said, the interpretation doing quite a lot of work to make it work, for the narrative. I mean, we're lucky in that respect because the collection obviously just lends itself so readily to that narrative. But I think the point about COVID, which I think I touched on at the beginning but didn't quite follow through on, is that exactly. I mean, this was fundamentally about, I mean, the way it was first pitched was, within the museum was to make an event out of a permanent collection, in circumstances where loan exhibitions were, called into question for all sorts of reasons, the financial reasons, but also the whole sort of knock-on effect of other exhibitions being cancelled on the broader sort of network of loans available. At the same time, you wanted to offer something that would encourage people to want to come back to a museum like the Queen's House. Even if they had been before, this was something new. And then in combination with that, we had these conservation projects ongoing. So that was something really to celebrate the kind of behind the scenes museum work that was going on. Of course, there were then also challenges in terms of just, the original object list being drawn up without the ability to go and look at objects, which, I mean, certainly there were changes made to the object list subsequently that, perhaps wouldn't have been made had we, in the first instance, not been locked down and able actually to access the objects that we were dealing with. So.
But I mean, to that point of the rarity of the project, I think it's pretty unusual to be able to do a 200 object exhibition, a monographic exhibition using the permanent collection as really the core. We did, of course, have 17 loans as well, which were very carefully selected to make the most and sort of celebrate these key works in the permanent collection. So, for example, drawings related to the Solvay tapestry, offsets from the Royal Visit to the Fleet. These were the objects that we were seeking out in order to make the most of our collection. I think it's also worth, though, to say that the kind of other side of the coin, if you like, with these permanent collection projects is the huge amount of work that goes on behind the scenes in the conservation team, in art handling across the museum to make it happen. This project had quite a short lead time from COVID to now for our colleagues in conservation to prepare a huge number of objects for the show, and we're very grateful to them. But there were, as Allison says, a lot of conversations about what was ready to hang, what needed work, and so on. I think by reducing the number of your loans, you're then possibly serving yourself with a different constraint in another area internally.
Was it always conceived that you would have it in the permanent collection galleries, or were you ever at one point discussing a special exhibition space?
I think if it was discussed, it was only very briefly, because I guess, like I was saying before, fundamentally this was about making that connection between the collection and the site, and to bring to life an aspect of the Queen's House that was not well known.
And you even did something with the labels, didn't you, to sort of identify pieces of a part of the show, very subtly. But I wonder if you could just mention that.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have any photos in the presentation of that, but yes, that was certainly a challenge, and we went over this quite a few times as to how best to actually communicate what is the exhibition and what is not the exhibition. Yes, our designer came up with an ingenious solution of a kind of chamfered border on our labels, which would be orange. So orange was kind of the guiding color, if you like, in the design scheme. Orange, obviously, standing for everything Dutch nowadays, at least. So that was that solution. And then there's a map actually that accompanies the exhibition that you pick up as you enter the building, and that indicates the rooms that are exhibition rooms as opposed to permanent collection rooms. There we go. Yeah.
Here it is.
Yeah, with the strong caveat, of course, that the Queen's House, at the best of times, is a confusing building to navigate. Yeah, we have, and actually this is a kind of a hangover from the immediate sort of post-lockdown approach that was taken in the house. But during that period, we introduced a sort of a one-way system through the house, which has been retained, and I think certainly helps people make their way through the exhibition. I think without that, they would probably be quite lost.
Oh, I think from the visitor's point of view, just walking through it, it feels very inventive that you've got all this context of the permanent collection while introducing a special exhibition and themes running through the special exhibition. So it feels like there's a lot going on, and it's really engaging that way and sort of interesting, and something you just, you don't see very often. And so I just think I'm sure there must have been some political issues you had to deal with when it came to permanent collection versus exhibition, but you seem to have navigated those fairly well, I think, because it seems like a fairly seamless experience and a good experience when you're walking through the exhibition.
That's right.
Yeah.
And you were talking about one aspect of this exhibition was that the Queen's House is a center of artistic production, in the 17th century. And at the end of the exhibition, you've brought in contemporary examples that are maybe inspired by the collection or the space. And I wonder if you could just talk about that aspect of the exhibition.
Sure. So the final room of the exhibition is a kind of legacy room, in the sense of the Van der Velde's legacy, and it covers really from the time of their deaths in the around 1700, should we say, through Turner, who of course famously said that the Van der Veldes made him a painter, or supposedly said that, and then right through to the contemporary 21st century, and I suppose I'll start with the work on the right, which was actually acquired at the 11th hour, just in time for the exhibition. We were really pleased we were able to do so. And this is a work by a London-based artist called Maisie Broadhead. It's a photographic work, but framed in this quite unusual sash window kind of frame. And those of you familiar with Dutch cabinet pictures of the 17th century will immediately recognize here a number of sort of references. Maisie in her work is very interested in engaging critically with the Old Master tradition. And here she's riffing, if you like, on the 17th century trope of a woman in a domestic interior. And there's a marine scene on the back wall, and we're supposed to use that or read that as a kind of key to understanding her situation, her psychological state, if you like. Instead here, we've got a rather more ambiguous scene. I think traditionally the idea is, you have this woman who is rather passive in her situation. Here, Maisie's slightly turned that on its head, and it's slightly unclear what has gone on here. But if you, I'm not sure if you can quite make it out on the presentation, but if you go and see this work, you'll see that the scene at this dinner table is one that suggests the aftermath of a violent incident of some kind, but it's unclear what exactly has happened here. But really, why we were so keen to have this in the show is, and I'm not sure if, depending on how your screen is set up, you may or may not be able to see the Van der Velde picture just to the right. But when I saw this work for the first time, I immediately thought of a picture in our collection of Van der Velde, which is very, very close. It's not actually this particular work. I thought originally that it might be. It's very similar to the one that's in the background of Maisie's work, and the role of this work in the exhibition, which is the last work that you see as you exit the exhibition, and you can actually, if the lighting is right, as in it's the right kind of day, the right kind of weather, you can actually see through across the orangery into the Van der Velde studio, and you can see this Van der Velde picture that is very close to it in appearance. You can actually see that on the vista, so you can almost compare the two side by side, if you like. But really, the role of this within the exhibition was to make that point that although the Van der Veldes were not, although the Van der Veldes now are not a household name, they are not as well known as some other painters, Dutch painters of the period, such as Rembrandt, Vermeer, so on. They are in many ways, if you like, literally household names, insofar as their impact on British taste has been so immense, really. If you think of any seascape that you might see, in a print in a doctor's waiting room, that kind of thing, marine painting has become so much part of the furniture of British taste, if you like, that we hardly notice that it's there. So that was the kind of the idea behind this work. Of course,
Allison, can I just jump in quickly? We've got so many questions. I just want to move to a related question, which takes us to the other picture, to the Kinder Riley. I think the other thing that you achieve in this final room is helping us to see again how political marine painting is. And again, it tends now to be seen as a kind of bland background form. Why all of these ships, such an obsession in the period? In a way, I think you're right. We've kind of forgotten how to read marine painting, even those of us who go to Greenwich and see the paintings. So I wonder if you might draw that out a little bit, or Imogen, either of you, in terms of what the kind of politics of these works was, and how we can kind of go back into that 17th century world in some ways like this 21st century world we're seeing with the fantastic giant Wiley painting.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. I mean, it's something we really wanted to do with the exhibition, and if we've managed to convey that at all, then we're so pleased. It was really key to this project that we said something of the kind of hidden legacies of slave ownership and of the slave trade in the Van der Velde's work, and of the Dutch East India Company in particular. We were particularly interested in how this affected artist materials on a broader subject for Dutch art from the Golden Age more generally, but as far as marine painting goes and the Van der Veldes go, it's worth noting who these people were, who were the Van der Veldes patrons. These are the admirals and the captains who were leaders of the Dutch Navy, leaders of the British Navy, but these people also had vested interests in the Dutch East India Company, in the English East India Company as well, and those legacies are really important to the project. We had hoped to do some work into our collection and into possible representations of merchant ships that might be identified, and this wasn't really possible in the end, possibly to do with the nature of Greenwich's collection. As you might imagine, our collection was formed by a lot of naval historians who are very interested in the kind of identifiable ships of the British Navy. So a slightly different, different kind of marine painting, if you like. But nonetheless, the funding for these huge naval battles, the Anglo-Dutch wars themselves, which the Van der Veldes were recording and implicated in, these were funded by exploitation in the East Indies. And yeah, this was really key to the project. The inclusion of the Kinde Wiley seemed it had to come in, and it feels like a very fitting end to the exhibition. Of course, in Kinde Wiley's comment that he is making about the history of marine painting more broadly, but also those kind of, and the legacies of maritime history, of maritime art, and this was an opportunity for us to showcase, I mean, Greenwich's role in collecting art of this kind. Royal Museums Greenwich was the first British public collection to acquire a work by Kinde Wiley, and it seemed like a very fitting way to wrap up this sort of element of the exhibition, if you like.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much. I was going to ask a little bit more about the digital initiatives, particularly the Getty-funded paper project that you mentioned, but I think you touched on that quite a lot in the opening. And I wonder, Greg, if you want to just jump in and talk about the other amazing fundraising initiative.
Yeah, and I think that the curators watching would be interested to hear about the crowdfunding that you did for the conservation of the Solvay tapestry, and through the Art Fund, and how that worked, because I think it's a great success story. So I wonder if you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, sure. So I was around. Allison was on maternity leave when we were sort of doing this moment of the project. So I'll just speak a little more about it. So for the funding of the Solvay tapestry conservation, this conservation cost upwards of £175,000, and we were very generously supported by lots and lots of different funders. But the last chunk of funding that we got was through a partnership with the Art Fund, with their Art Happens series of campaigns, which are essentially crowdfunding campaigns. We made a series of videos, and we had a launch day, and we launched this crowdfunding campaign, and we managed to raise our entire £15,000 target on the first day, which had never happened before with an Art Happens campaign, and we then extended our deadline for the project, and we doubled our target pretty much. I think we raised something like 28,000 in the end towards the conservation of the tapestry, and this, of course, enabled us to complete the conservation of the tapestry, to put it back on display after so many decades off display. But I think most importantly, it really drew attention to the project, and I think garnered a certain amount of warmth and enthusiasm for the project. It was particularly interesting to see the kinds of donations that were being made, and the kinds of comments that were being made on the Art Happens posting board, where you can see, and I think the Solvay tapestry in particular seems to have garnered a huge amount of interest from a really wide range of people. We had maritime history people, we had people local to Solvay, we had people who are tapestry makers themselves. I remember we had donations made in memory of people who were tapestry enthusiasts and weavers, as well as a lot of community crafts, community donors as well. So this, I think it really demonstrated how one object can really unite a very, very diverse audience, and to bring very different people into an exhibition about marine painting, if you like. And it's been really nice being in the exhibition and meeting with people who have specifically come to see the tapestry and who, gave money or heard about it through that process of giving money. Yes, I'll stop there. I know we've got questions to answer.
Just a quick follow-up. I think people might be interested about just what the mechanics of that program are. Is it something you have to apply for, get accepted, or how does that work?
I'm afraid I wasn't there for that particular moment, but I believe it was through contacting the Art Fund. I don't think it was an application process as such, a kind of competition, but rather a dialogue and a conversation. Yeah.
Great.
And also just quickly, the kind of nuts and bolts museum-y question, which is that set of associations that have now come out through that project captured in some way in, let's say, the collections management system or the item record, or is there any way to keep a kind of enhanced record of the associations now, not just to acknowledge the people who helped with the conservation, but all of those associations?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I think we would have to ask our development department. I'm not sure whether there might be GDPR issues or something, but yeah, it's a really good question.
I mean, because when we were at the V&A, when I was at the V&A, we would sometimes talk about kind of trying to attach oral histories to the catalog item in some way, and I just, it would be really nice to enhance the record of the object history now that you've done it. You've really done that, which is amazing.
It's a really nice idea, and actually the museum is very actively collecting oral histories in a sort of slightly different, more maritime history context. It's a really big area of our collections development at the moment. So that's a great suggestion, and I shall take it away and have a think.
Fantastic. Greg, did you want to jump in with anything else, or should we open it up?
Up to you. We can open it up, see how that goes.
Let's just see. We can hand the mic over to the audience now. We can certainly hear any questions people have. I know someone just wrote in the chat, basically just to let you know, there are two ways now to ask a question of Allison and or Imogen. You can actually type the question in the chat and we will see it and read it. But you can also raise hand. And if you know how to do that, you use the reactions button at the bottom in the toolbar of Zoom. And you should be able to raise your hand. And I can then ask you to unmute and ask your question directly. So if you do have questions, please, by all means, do raise them. If you don't, we have plenty more and we'll carry on for a little while. So I see one question that's just come in to the chat, which is about asking, so actually two questions. So I'll read these right away. And then again, if anyone has questions they'd like to ask directly, please do raise your hand. Clara Davarpana asks, are the frames in the exhibition, which is actually a really interesting question, original to the collection, to the Queen's house? Did they inform your display decisions? If so, how? What was your frame selection process? And there's a special interest in the ripple mold frames around the ink drawings of seascapes. So over to you guys for that one.
I'm so sorry, I'm having a bit of a coughing fit.
Yeah,
the frames, yeah, it's a really good question.
The royal visit frame. So we spoke very briefly about the conservation of the royal visit. Firstly, to answer your question, very broadly, we didn't change frames for this exhibition, and in some cases, the conservation of the frames was very important in preparing these works for the project. But the most important frame that we prepared for the project was the frame for the Royal Visit to the Fleet, which you can see here. And you'll notice it's got this more unusual silvered finish. And this was part of the conservation project, and our frames conservators worked on this to prepare the frame for the exhibition. Technical analysis was done of the frame, and it was found that underneath many layers of newer gilding, there was some evidence of silver leaf, and this is of course very much in keeping with a kind of British Baroque taste for these kind of silvered frames as well, and so the decision was made to go for it, if you like, and to finish the frame in this way, especially for the exhibition. Allison, do you want to say anything else about this frame?
No, I mean, I think you've said it all, really. I mean, yeah, as Imogen says, this was the frame was absolutely integral to the broader conservation project on this picture, which was funded again by a whole range of funding bodies, but perhaps foremost amongst them the Art Fund. We received a major conservation grant from them for this, and the frame was central to that application. As Imogen says, it's thought to be the original frame to the picture, and we had both the actual technical evidence of an original silvered scheme, and also sort of broader sources, such as, for example, Samuel Pepys, who was very heavily involved in maritime circles, on the board of the Admiralty, secretary to the board of the Admiralty. There are letters from Pepys talking about having pictures framed in silvered frames. So the idea that within that network so close to the Van der Veldes, you have people talking about silvered frames. It seemed appropriate, yeah, I mean, there are interesting questions there as to sort of what a silver frame looked like originally in the 17th century. They tended to be lacquered in some way, which, and indeed the technical analysis of this frame sort of bears that out. The lacquer is possibly to make them look gold, or possibly just to possibly as a sort of protective coating, because of course silver would tarnish otherwise. So there's a kind of, it's unclear exactly what silvered frames really looked like at the time, but it seems to me, on the basis of the evidence that we have, that there was something inherently attractive in silvered frames as opposed to gold ones. And certainly in this case, we feel that the silvered look does sort of work quite nicely with the sort of the grey green sea kind of tones within the picture. And indeed our conservator who was working on this did look very carefully at it, sort of, it's not all sort of a uniform tone. It does communicate very carefully with the picture that it frames. So.
Right. Just a super simple question that somebody asked, but a good one is it possible for people to get high resolution images of either the install or of the objects? What can people turn to in order to see these images?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure whether our so there is an RMG images website, and I believe that allows you to download images at a low resolution for sort of private study purposes. But I'm not actually sure whether it would include things such as installation shots, unfortunately.
Okay. Perhaps
it depends what the purpose is. I mean, people are welcome to, get in touch.
Okay, good. So Moni, maybe you can approach them directly. There's a really good question from Robert Wenley that Greg and or I were definitely going to tease out, which is really just to ask you about kind of what you most learned about the Van de Velde's art and practice from the research that you did. What excited you most from a kind of technical knowledge point of view?
That's a great question. And actually, one thing that we haven't really mentioned is the fact that this whole process has been, if you like, a kind of rediscovery of the Van de Veldes as just artists, like leave aside the fact that they're maritime, marine artists, that actually, and we slightly kind of hesitantly but sort of gradually came to the conclusion, and perhaps someone will correct us, but we reached the conclusion really that this collection and really particularly the drawing collection has to surely be unique in terms of what it can tell us about how an artist studio functioned at the time. I mean, the drawings really were, and this was, where the Getty paper project grant really came into its own, and just sort of, ring fencing that time to be able to actually really engage with those drawings as physical objects and to look at them from that perspective as sort of relics of studio process. It was particularly, I think, in the case of the drawings, just really understanding to what extent they were the lifeblood of the studio, and the very kind of specific ways in which they were used. So, for example, the offset process, which we touched on before, but also just little like revelations, like graphite makes complete sense because it's waterproof, things like that, I think. And we're hoping to together with our conservator colleague Emmanuel Lajto, who's now at the National Portrait Gallery, we're hoping to do some sort of article, just sort of bring together the findings from that.
Great. What about you, Imogen?
I mean, my absolute go-to is the sheer variety of the Van de Velde's drawings in particular. Really, I spent a lot of time with Emmanuel going through the drawings in preparation for the selection for the exhibition, and also in preparation for the digitalization of the drawings. And 1400 Van de Velde drawings. It sounds like it might not be the most exciting of times in a drawing studio, but oh my gosh, so varied. And as Allison has said, from offsets to sketches to ship portraits. I mean, there are so many different kinds of drawings, and getting a sense, I think, of not just the practicalities of how drawings works, but also the kind of play with drawings. Some of them are very rapid, and you get a sense of the number of hands involved as well. I mean, we've talked about Velde the Elder and Velde the Younger, but we also have to think about the other Van de Veldes, the third generation of Van de Veldes, Cornelis van de Velde, and others working in the studio. One of the most wonderful subsections of the collection that I didn't know before is a group of instructional drawings. And here, actually, the lower left, Allison is showing a really wonderful example. Drawings essentially put together in order to teach students how to create a marine painting, and these ones here, they have little annotations for I think it's the sun and the wind and these sort of directions, and how the sun and the wind and how this affects the way that a boat moves in the water. There are many drawings like this, and a huge number of works that show a kind of enthusiasm for the next generation of marine painters, as well as just the creations of the father and son themselves.
Yeah, amazing. And I did think the family story was extraordinary and unusual, the way the father's drawings became part of the paintings and painting legacy of the son. It's quite unusual, quite extraordinary. Yeah, this image here, but also the insertion of drawings within paintings, and quite an eye-opener, I think, for those of us interested in the relationship between drawing and painting.
Bill, I actually got to that point. I wanted to just ask, and you'd mentioned that the strength of the elder was being a draftsman in line, and he encouraged his son to go into painting. Was this a business decision so they could sort of represent all sorts of medium and just be more economically viable, or what was the impetus behind that?
I imagine so. I mean, one thing that really comes through very strongly throughout their entire kind of narrative is that they were nothing if not very canny businessmen. Right from the move from Amsterdam to England being just one example. So I think certainly in ensuring that the younger was actually trained as an oil painter was a way of sort of diversifying the studio offer, if you like.
And I think that's also sort of seen through in Van der Velde the Elder's development of his pen paintings. They are constructed in such a way as to be able to compete with oil paintings hanging on the wall, but they were extremely time consuming to make. It would have been much more efficient for him to have an oil painter in the studio producing these kinds of works, in addition to the incredible time consuming work that he was doing himself. But of course, later in their lives, when they come to London, the younger then seems to have taught his father how to paint in oil as well, and he is also painting in oil at this sort of a second wave in his career, when he's also producing paintings in color, which is a sort of, again, another kind of interesting complication of this father-son dynamic and the way that the studio operated together.